Hey, everybody. In this podcast, I want to talk about by far the biggest losers of the Texas Revolution, and those were the Tejanos that lived in Texas. Remember, by the time of the Revolution, Tejanos were greatly outnumbered by Anglos who had come into Texas by 1836. There were more actually African Americans in Texas than Tejanos. 5,000 or so African Americans, maybe 4,500 Tejanos. But Tejanos, this was an area that they had ruled really since 1718. And they go from being rulers of Texas, Mexican Texas, and before that Spanish Texas, to becoming a despised minority in Texas and one that was subject to great racial discrimination, and in some ways a discrimination that has still, in terms of social equality, economic equality, uh, has had a very negative impact on the Tejano community to this very day. And this goes into this idea about how, especially if you're Tejano or Tejana, you may not care about history, but history certainly cares about you. So, to start, I just want to say by the time of the Texas Revolution, Tejanos were caught increasingly between the Anglo American settlers, most of whom actually settled in East Texas. There wasn't that much mixing between Tejanos and Anglo American settlers before the Mexican Revolution. Um, the majority of Tejanos were in San Antonio, there were some in Nacogdoches. But still, Tejanos are caught in between the Anglo settlers and Mexican officials, who more and more are trying to gain control or regain control over Mexican Texas. Many Tejanos, as hopefully you remember, supported the Texas Revolution when Santa Anna, after he grabbed power in 1835. But probably a lot more Tejanos just stayed neutral. Some actually supported Santa Anna, but I would say the majority of Tejanos, when the Texas Revolution was going on, just basically tried to stay out of it. It's a really a vicious war, and people just didn't want to get involved in the war if they could help it. So Tejanos in San Antonio and Tejanas, often if they had ranchos, they went to the ranchos. They just tried to lay low as the war was swirling on around them. Um, and then what happens is after the Texas Revolution, um, Tejanos are subject to a tremendous amount of racism. And the years after 1836 were a very, very bitter experience for the majority of Tejanos. Um, Tejanos were caught between two worlds. They were between Mexico and the United or Anglo Americans. And remember, most Anglos in Texas at this time were from the United States. And so, in a very real way, Tejanos were a people without a place. Mexico didn't accept them because Mexico was mad at Tejanos because they knew that some very profile Tejanos such as Juan Seguin and Navarro and De Zavala had supported the Texas Revolution. So the folks in Mexico were not sympathetic to Tejanos. They thought the Tejanos were traitors. And U.S. Anglos that were coming into Texas, they just felt like anyone of Spanish or Mexican descent that they ran into, for a majority of Anglos coming into Texas, they just assumed that these folks had sided with Santa Anna, that they were the enemy, that in some cases they were trying to help runaway slaves get into Mexico. And so the Tejanos become a people without a place, caught between two very hostile worlds, between Mexico, who were mad at the Tejanos, and Anglo Americans coming into Texas, who really despise the Tejanos and see them as inferior racially. Um, Also, think about what it was like if you're a Tejano, that you're forced to conduct business in many cases in English, when your whole life everything had been in Spanish. When almost literally overnight, many laws, many aspects of daily life go from Spanish to English. Think about what that would be like. Why would the Tejanos have learned English? They lived in Mexico and before that in Spain. So why would they have ever learned English? Now suddenly, many of the most important aspects of their life, especially the legal aspects of their lives, are suddenly in English. They weren't familiar with the politics of the Republic of Texas, which were deeply influenced by the United States, not Mexico. Many of the Anglos that came into Texas after 1836 were Protestants that really had nothing but contempt for the Catholic Church. They felt like the Catholic Church, that Catholics were basically just puppets of the Pope in Rome. And so not only did many of the Anglos that came into Texas, the vast majority of whom were Protestants, not only did they despise people of Mexican descent because of their skin color, they automatically felt because Tejanos were darker skinned that they were inferior. They also despised the language and the religion of Tejanos as well. Um, so, and on top of all that, Tejanos were threatened by violence in the post 1836 period, and at times were actually assaulted, especially when they stood up for their land rights. Because, as I've really tried to stress in this part of the course, Anglos that come into Texas, they want land because why do they want land? You should know by now. They want to grow cotton. Some Anglos are growing cattle or not growing cattle, but they're domesticating cattle. But the big push for Anglos pouring into Texas after 1836 is for land to grow cotton. And who own this land? In many cases, Tejanos own this land, especially in East Texas. They'd owned it for generations because it had been granted to them during the Spanish period and for a smaller number of Tejanos during the Mexican period as well. And so there were intense fights about land rights, who owned what land. Um, in 1837, I'm not going to test you on that date, but after the Texas Revolution, the General Land Office of Texas established land commissioners for each county, and only Anglos could participate in the surveying of the land that was surveyed under the new law. And understandably, Tejanos viewed this as a very hostile act, which would result in the loss, as it did, in their land claims. So Tejanos, and it's just hard to it's really hard to express. Just almost overnight, Tejanos go from ruling Texas, although they were minority by 1836, to being completely in a new country with a different language, different system of laws, a hostile people coming in from the United States, people that were not sympathetic to them, didn't feel the need to work with them, and in many cases, the Anglos coming in from the United States felt like the Tejanos they encountered had somehow been involved in the Alamo or Goliad, and they were enemies, enemies that needed to be subjugated. So, what you start, and on top of it, and let me throw one other thing in, I mentioned this, there was a belief among the Anglos coming into Texas and the Anglos that were already here, there was a belief that Tejanos were sympathetic to slaves and that Tejanos were actually creating kind of a Texas Underground Railroad to get slaves into Mexico, where of course that they'd be immediately freed. Now it's unclear how sympathetic Tejanos were to slaves. Some certainly were. Probably not to the extent that Anglos suspected them of being sympathetic to slaves. But on top of everything else, this is another layer of hostility. So what you have is a major transfer of land in the post 1836 period from Tejano hands into Anglo hands. Ultimately, more than 1 million acres of land changed hands from Tejano to Anglo in the decade after 1836. I'm going to throw out another fact to you, factoid. You don't have to remember this, but I just want you to get the general picture. What we're seeing is this massive transfer of land from Tejano hands into Anglo hands in the post-revolutionary period. So, for instance, in the Goliad area around Victoria and Goliad, there were 49 ranches at the time of the Texas Revolution. There were 49 ranches in the Goliad, Victoria area that belonged to Tejanos. Within 10 years, 40 of these 49 ranches belonged to Anglos. Okay, so it goes from 49 ranches belonging to Tejanos in the Goliad, Victoria area to 10 years later, 40 of these 49 ranches were in Anglo hands. So we're talking about millions of acres of land being transferred. Now, you might think, well, why was that so bad? The problem was many of these land transfers came under the threat of violence, that if the Tejanos didn't sell their land, they would either be shot, they would be harassed. Often the Tejanos feel like they need to flee from these areas because of the hostility they faced from Anglos, and often they sold their land just at pennies at the dollar. Land that was very, very valuable was sold to Anglos at a very cheap rate. And finally, because of the court system, and this is something else that Tejanos had to face, they had to face a completely different court system that was dominated by Anglos. The courts often ruled against Tejanos. So if there was some kind of land fraud or chicanery, it was very hard for the Tejanos to do anything about it because the judges were often sympathetic to the Anglos and not sympathetic at all to Tejanos. So it was a very rough period for Tejanos after 1836, one that arguably lasted for 150 years, and we still see the issues, the social inequality, the economic inequality, the second-class citizenship. We still see that visited upon the Tejano population in Texas, in parts of Texas anyway, until this very day.